The week before the county was set to take her house, Iris Caldwell spent almost the last of her money on a place 3 hours north that every sensible person in her life told her was worth nothing at all. A dead woman's estate. A house that had stood with its shutters latched for longer than her grandson had been alive. Her own nephew sat at her kitchen table and told her, in the careful voice you use with someone you have privately decided is no longer quite right, that grief had finally gotten the better of her judgment. Maybe it had. She was 68 years old, 8 months behind on a mortgage she could not pay, raising a boy who was not hers to raise except that there was no one else left to do it, and she was about to gamble $100 on a county lien for a property she had never laid eyes on. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. But 3 nights after that conversation, when Iris stood in the cold of an upstairs room her great-aunt had sealed away behind a wall built to look as though it had always been a wall, and she worked her fingers into a seam that no one was ever supposed to find, what waited for her in the dark was worth $470 million. And it came wrapped around a secret that one of the most admired families in the country had spent 70 years and a great deal of money of their own, making certain no living person would ever uncover. The kitchen smelled of coffee she had not been able to make herself drink. It had gone cold in the cup an hour ago, a brown skin forming on top, and Iris kept her hands around it anyway because the radiator only warmed the front room and the kitchen held the chill the way old houses do in November. On the table in front of her sat the letter from the bank. She had read it so many times that the creases had gone soft and furred, and the words no longer landed the way they had the first morning. Notice of intent. Reinstatement amount. A figure with a comma in it that she could not produce if she sold everything in the house twice over. Down the hall, the boy was asleep. Eli was 8 years old, small for it, with his mother's straight dark hair and a habit of going still and watchful whenever a grown-up's voice dropped. He had learned that the way some children learn to read, early and without being taught, because the year he turned 6 his whole world had come apart in an afternoon on a wet stretch of highway, and he had spent the time since learning to hold himself carefully so as not to be a burden to the one person he had left. He slept with a small brass compass under his pillow. It had belonged to Iris's husband, Walt, who used to take the boy fishing before the cancer, and Eli carried it everywhere, checking it in the way other children check a phone, as though it might one day tell him which direction the lost people had gone. Iris had worked 31 years behind a counter. Adler's, on the corner of Sumner and 3rd, back when downtown still had corners worth standing on. She had started there at 26, a young woman with steady hands and no plan, and she had stayed because it turned out the steady hands were a kind of gift. She learned to clean a ring without scratching the shoulders of the setting. She learned the weight of real gold against the lightness of plate. She learned, over years, to tell paste from stone with nothing but a loop and the way light moved. And there were old men in that city who would wait 3 days for Iris to be the one to look at a piece, because she would not lie to them about what they had. The shop closed in the spring. The owner's son had no use for a watch counter in an age when no one owned a watch, and so the doors were chained and the cases were sold to a wholesaler in 2 afternoons, and Iris Caldwell, who could date a diamond cut to the decade by the angle of its facets, was 68 and unemployed in a city that no longer needed what she knew. It was the layering of it that had buried her. Walt's last year had eaten the savings the way a fire eats a barn, slow and then all at once. Then Hannah, her only child, gone in a sound of brakes and glass, and Eli arriving on her doorstep with a garbage bag of clothes and a caseworker who looked tired before she even sat down. Iris had not hesitated for 1 second about the boy. She would have sold the marrow out of her bones for that child. But love does not make a mortgage payment, and grief does not return your phone calls. And somewhere in the long gray middle of all of it, the months had slid by until the letters from the bank stopped being warnings and started being a date. So when the phone rang that evening, a number she did not know, an area code she could not place, she almost let it die. She had stopped answering numbers she did not know months ago. There was never anything on the other end but a recording, or a person reading from a script, or the particular brightness of someone about to ask her for money she did not have. But the cup in her hands had gone cold, and the boy was asleep, and the silence of the kitchen had a weight to it that she suddenly could not stand. And so she answered, mostly to hear another human voice. The man on the line was old. She could hear it in the unhurried way he formed his words, the slight catch and pause of someone who had read a great many careful documents aloud over a long life. He asked if he was speaking with Iris Caldwell, and when she said yes, he gave his name as Edwin Rourke, an attorney in the town of Hadley Falls, and said he had been trying to reach her for the better part of 2 weeks. "I think you have the wrong Caldwell," she said. "I don't know anybody in Hadley Falls. I don't even know where that is." "It's north," he said, "up in the hills, past the reservoir. There's not much reason to know where it is unless you have business. Here." A pause. "And you do have business here, Mrs. Caldwell, though I expect it will come as a surprise. Does the name Cordelia Ashgrove mean anything to you?" It did, the way the name of a town you passed through once as a child means something. Iris sat with it for a moment, turning it over. Ashgrove. Her mother had said that name perhaps a handful of times in Iris's whole life, always with a strange tightness around the mouth, the way you say the name of a relative who did something the family never forgave and never explained. Aunt Cora, her grandmother's older sister, the one who went up into the hills before Iris was born and never came back down, who sent a card once, a single time, the week Iris was born, and then nothing, for 68 years. A photograph somewhere in a box, a severe young woman in a high collar, not smiling. The family ghost. "She was my grandmother's sister," Iris said slowly. "My great-aunt. I never met her. I don't think anyone in my family met her, not since they were children." "Miss Ashgrove passed away," Edwin Rourke said. "A year ago this past August. I'm sorry to be so long in reaching the family, but Miss Ashgrove kept no relations close, and tracing her line took some doing. You are, as it happens, the last of it, the sole heir." Iris let out a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Heir to what?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Rourke, I don't mean to be rude, but if you knew the kind of week I'm having you'd understand why this is hard to take seriously. People don't leave me things. People take things from me. That's been the arrangement for a while now." "I understand," he said, and something in the way he said it made her believe he might. "What Miss Ashgrove left is the Ashgrove estate. The house and the land it sits on. 12 acres at the end of the Falls Road. The house itself something near 140 years old. I will be honest with you, Mrs. Caldwell, because I think you are a person who would rather have it straight. The house has been closed up a long while. Miss Ashgrove lived in only a few rooms of it her last years, and she was past 90, and the place needs more than I can promise you in a phone call. There is a county lien against it for back taxes. $100, all told. The estate has no cash to settle it. To take possession, you would need to come up here, sign the papers in front of me, and pay that $100 yourself. After that, the house is yours, free and clear, to do with as you see fit." There it was, the brightness she had been bracing for, except it had come dressed as a gift, which was somehow worse. A condemned house in the hills, $100 to take on a problem she could not afford to have. She thought of her own house, the one she was about to lose, and the cruelty of being offered a different one she could not keep either. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I don't have $100 to spend on a house 3 hours away. I'm about to lose the one I'm sitting in." "I know," he said simply. "I know, because Miss Ashgrove suspected as much. She kept track of you, Mrs. Caldwell, in her way. There were clippings in her study, a small notice from years back about the jewelry shop where you worked, your husband's obituary, your daughter's. I found them in a folder with your name on it. She knew your life had not been easy, and she left something else, besides the house. A letter. She was very particular that I give it to you by hand, here, in Hadley Falls, and not send it through the mail. She wrote your name on the front herself. She said, and I am quoting her now because the line stayed with me, she said the girl will think it isn't worth the drive, and she will be wrong, and you must not let her decide before she has seen it." The girl. A woman of 68 had not been a girl in a long time, but to a woman of 96 perhaps everyone after a certain point was a girl. Iris sat very still in her cold kitchen. The radiator ticked. Down the hall, the boy turned over in his sleep, and she heard the small click of the compass shifting under his pillow. She did not say yes to Edwin Rourke that night. She told him she would think on it, and he said he understood, and gave her the number again slowly, and told her the weather in the hills was turning, that the first hard freeze was due by the weekend, that if she meant to come she ought to come before the roads got mean. Then he wished her a good night with an old-fashioned courtesy that she had not heard from a stranger in years, and the line went dead, and Iris sat in the kitchen until the cold drove her to bed. She told Dale about it the next morning, because Dale was the only family she had left who answered when she called, and because a part of her wanted to be talked out of the foolishness she could already feel taking root in her chest. Dale was her sister's boy, 44 now, a man who sold commercial insurance and believed, with the unshakable conviction of a person who had never once been desperate, that every problem in the world was simply a failure to plan. He came by on his way to a client, stood in her kitchen in his good coat, and listened with his arms crossed while she told him about the call. "Aunt Iris," he said when she finished, and she heard the sigh underneath it before he even sighed it. "You cannot be serious. $100. To you. Right now. It's a house, Dale. A whole house and 12 acres. It's a liability." He said the word the way he said everything, like he was reading it off a form. "You think the county wants $100 for a place worth having? They want $100 because nobody's wanted the place in years, and they'd rather get 100 than nothing. You walk into that, you own the taxes going forward, the upkeep, the insurance, the liability if some kid breaks his neck on the porch. You're not inheriting a house. You're inheriting somebody else's problem, and you've got plenty of your own." He softened, a little, because he was not a cruel man, only a certain one. "Look, I've been meaning to say this. Have you thought about the apartments out by the medical center? They've got senior units, and they take the housing voucher, and they'd be a sight easier on you than this old place. And well," he glanced down the hall toward the room where Eli was getting dressed for school. "There are people who do this. Take kids. Good people, vetted, with the resources for it. Nobody would think less of you. You're 68, Aunt Iris. You raised your own. You don't have to do it twice with no money and no help." She had known the suggestion was coming. He had circled it for weeks, never quite landing. And she understood that he meant it as kindness, that in his ledger of the world handing the boy to the system and herself to a senior unit was simply the sensible adjustment of a position that had become untenable. But it lit something in her all the same, a small clean flame she had thought the year had put out. "His name is Eli," she said, "and he's mine. There's no version of any of this where that part changes." Dale held up his hands. "I'm just saying, don't throw good money after bad. That $100 won't save the house. So why give it to a dead woman's ruin?" And that, she would think later, was the thing he got exactly backwards, though he could not have known it. Because the $100 would not save the house. She had done that arithmetic 100 times. $100 against the figure with the comma, and it was a raindrop against a drought. The bank was going to take her home, whether she spent that 100 or hoarded it, whether she sat tight and sensible or drove 3 hours into the hills. The $100 was already lost. The only question was whether she lost it doing nothing, or lost it on the one strange chance that a woman she had never met had reached out from beyond her own death to offer her something. Put that way, sitting alone after Dale had gone to his client, it did not feel like recklessness at all. It felt like the only free choice she had left. She picked Eli up from school that afternoon and told him, in the careful plain way she had learned he needed, that they were going to take a drive. A long one, north, to see a house that belonged to family. He looked at her with those still watchful eyes and asked if they were moving, because he had heard the word apartment through a closed door, and he understood more than anyone gave him credit for. And Iris crouched down on the cracked linoleum of the school hallway and took his small face in her 2 hands and told him they were going on an adventure, the 2 of them, and that no matter what happened, wherever they went together. He thought about it. Then he took the compass out of his pocket, checked it against the front doors of the school as though confirming that north was where it had been that morning, and put it away, and said, "Okay, Graham. Together." And that was that. They left before dawn on Saturday, because Edwin Rourke had said come before the freeze, and the freeze was due Saturday night. Iris's car was a 15-year-old hatchback with a check engine light she had learned to think of as a companion, and she packed it the night before with their 2 duffels, a cooler of sandwiches and the good thermos, a road atlas because she did not trust the phone to hold a signal in the hills, and a flashlight, the heavy kind, because something told her a closed-up house would not have its lights on. Eli sat in the back with the compass in one fist and a library book in his lap, and as the city fell away behind them, and the highway opened up into bare November country, He watched the world go by with the grave attention of a boy who had learned not to assume any place would still be there when he looked again. The land changed as they climbed. The flat gray sprawl gave way to long fields gone tan and stubbled, then to woods, the trees stripped down to their black architecture, the last leaves rattling and letting go. The towns thinned out and grew farther apart and poorer, the kind of towns that had been built around a mill or a quarry that closed before Iris was born, still standing because the people in them had nowhere else to go. The sky lowered. By the time they turned off the state route onto the smaller roads, the phone had given up entirely, just as she had known it would, and she navigated by the atlas and by Edwin Rourke's written directions, which she had copied out in her own hand on a sheet of paper, now soft with handling. "Graham," Eli said from the back, somewhere past noon, "how come we never met Aunt Cora?" Iris watched the road. The first flakes had started, light and dry, dancing across the windshield and not sticking, the front edge of the weather Rourke had warned her about. "She liked to be alone," she said. "She went up into the hills a long time ago, before I was even born, and she didn't come back down. Nobody in the family really knew why. Was she mad at everybody? I don't know, baby. Maybe. Or maybe everybody was mad at her. Sometimes it's hard to tell, after enough years, which one came first." "That's sad," Eli said, with the simple certainty children bring to the things adults have learned to talk around. Being alone that long. Iris did not have an answer for that, so she reached back without taking her eyes off the road, and the boy met her hand with his, and they drove on into the thickening snow. They came into Hadley Falls a little after 2 in the afternoon, and it was the kind of town that looked as though it had been waiting a long time for something that was not coming. A main street 4 blocks long, brick buildings the color of dried blood, half of them dark, their windows soaped over or boarded. A church with a white steeple gone gray. A diner with a hand-lettered sign and one truck parked out front. A general store, a post office, a bank that had become a hardware store, and a hardware store that had become nothing. The Falls, the town, was named for Ran. Somewhere behind it all, a low constant sound under everything. The river dropping over a granite shelf the way it had since before there was a town to name for it. Snow sat on the awnings and in the gutters and made the whole sorry place look, for a moment, like a photograph of itself from a better year. Edwin Rourke's office was a narrow storefront between the closed pharmacy and an empty lot, a light burning in the front window against the gray afternoon. Iris parked the hatchback at the curb and sat for a moment with the engine ticking, gathering herself, and Eli unbuckled and pressed his face to the window and said, "It looks like a town in a snow globe somebody forgot to shake," which was so exactly right that she laughed for the first time in what felt like days. Inside, the office was warm and close and smelled of paper and coffee and the particular mustiness of a building that had held the same files for 50 years. The man who rose from behind the desk to meet them was in his late 70s, tall and stooped, in a cardigan worn soft at the elbows, with wire-rimmed glasses and a long, kind face and hands that trembled very slightly, the tremor of age and not of nerves. He took her hand in both of his. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "you came. I confess I wasn't certain you would. And this must be the boy." He looked down at Eli with a smile that reached all the way up into his eyes. "What's your name, young man?" "Eli," the boy said. "We came in the snow." "You did indeed. And just ahead of the worst of it, I'd say. Smart of your grandmother." He waved them to 2 chairs across from the desk and poured Iris a cup of coffee from a percolator on a side table, strong and black, and produced from a drawer, without being asked, a stick of peppermint for the boy, which suggested to Iris that Edwin Rourke had been a grandfather himself, once, or a great one. She wrapped both hands around the hot cup and felt the cold of the drive begin to leave her, and across the desk the old lawyer opened a folder thick with years. "Cordelia Ashgrove was my client for 40 years, he said. "I was a young man when I took over her affairs from my father, who had them before me. She was, even then, a very old woman, and a very private one. There are not 5 people in this town who could tell you her face. She came down to the bank twice a year, and to no place else. And she paid Marian Pratt to bring her groceries and look in on the pipes, and otherwise she lived up at that house alone with her work and her books, and asked nothing of anybody." He paused and looked at Iris over the tops of his glasses. "I should tell you, before we go on, that you are not the only person to take an interest in the Ashgrove estate of late. In the last year, I have had 2 letters and 1 telephone call from a firm down in the city, lawyers representing a private party, inquiring whether the estate had passed to an heir and whether that heir might be interested in selling. They were very polite and very persistent, and they did not say who their client was, which in my experience is a thing people do when the answer would tell you more than they want you to know. A small cold finger touched the back of Iris's neck. Selling what? You said the house was a ruin. The house, the contents, the land, all of it, as is, sight unseen. Edwin Rourke folded his hands. They offered a figure for it. I'll tell you the figure, Mrs. Caldwell, because I think you ought to know it before you sign anything. They offered $400,000 for a closed-up house with a $100 tax lien against it, that no local would give you $4,000 for. Cash. Sight unseen. He let that sit. Now, I have practiced law in these hills for half a century, and I have learned one thing for certain. When a stranger from the city offers you a fortune for something you have been told is worthless, the worthless thing is not the thing. The worthless thing is the story you have been told about it. He slid the folder a little closer to her. Miss Ashgrove anticipated this too. It is, I believe, much of why she was so insistent that her heir come and see the place with her own eyes before deciding anything, before anyone could talk her out of it with a number. Iris thought of Dale and her kitchen, of the apartments by the medical center, of the $100 he had told her not to throw away. For $100,000. The figure was so far beyond anything in her life that it did not feel like money. It felt like a sum read off a board. For $100,000 would settle the bank and leave enough besides to raise the boy without ever lying awake doing arithmetic again. And there was a part of her, a tired and frightened part, that wanted to say sell it today, sign the paper and take the money and let the strangers from the city have whatever it was they wanted. But Edwin Rourke had said the worthless thing is not the thing, and Iris Caldwell had spent 31 years learning to tell paste from stone, and the oldest instinct she had, the one that had made men wait 3 days for her to be the one to look, was telling her that you do not offer $400,000, cash, sight unseen, for paste. You said there was a letter, she said. The old lawyer nodded, and reached into the folder, and drew out an envelope. It was heavy cream paper, yellowed faintly at the edges with the years it had waited, and across the front, in a strong old-fashioned hand, the ink gone a little brown, was written, for Iris. To be read at Ashgrove, and nowhere else. The flap was sealed with a disc of dark red wax, and pressed into the wax was an image she had to tilt toward the window light to make out. 2 hands. A pair of hands, cupped, holding something small between them, the way you would hold a coal, or a seed, or a single precious stone. She wanted you to read it in the house, Edwin Rourke said. She was very clear on that. She said the house would explain the letter, and the letter would explain the house, and that one without the other was only half of the truth. I have honored a great many strange instructions from that woman over 40 years, Mrs. Caldwell, and I will tell you that she was never once, in all that time, wrong about anything that mattered. He folded his trembling hands. Now, there is the matter of the $100, and there are papers for you to sign. And then, if you are willing, the keys are yours, and the house is yours, and you may go up the Falls Road and see for yourself what your great-aunt thought was worth a stranger's $400,000 and your one drive into the hills. Iris set the letter down on the desk, beside the cold rim of her coffee cup, and looked at the 2 cupped hands in the wax for a long moment. Then she opened her wallet, and she counted out $100 in worn bills onto the old lawyer's desk, the last $100 of free money in her life, and she signed her name where he showed her, on line after line, and Edwin Rourke witnessed each one with his trembling hand, and somewhere in the signing the Ashgrove estate, the house and the 12 acres, and whatever waited in the dark inside it, passed quietly into the keeping of a woman the world had spent a year deciding to forget. He gave her a ring of keys, heavy and old, the iron worn smooth, each one tagged in faded ink in a hand she would come to know as Cora's own. Front, kitchen, cellar, study, and one small key, smaller than the others, with no tag at all, its head wrought in the shape of those same 2 cupped hands. He gave her a hand-drawn map of the property and the name and number of Marian Pratt, the woman who had kept the place, who he said would have turned the heat up and looked in that morning when she heard from him that the heir was finally coming. And he walked them to the door, and shook Eli's hand with great solemnity, and told Iris that he was 5 minutes down the road in town and that she should call him if she needed anything, though he warned her, with an apologetic smile, that the telephone line up at Ashgrove was 100 years old and the cell signal did not reach past the reservoir, and that she would, for a night or two at least, be more alone up there than she had likely ever been in her life. "We'll be all right," Iris said, and was surprised to find she half believed it. "We're good at alone, the two of us. We've had practice." The Falls Road climbed out of town and kept climbing, a narrow blacktop that turned to gravel and then to packed dirt, the woods crowding close on either side, the snow heavier now and beginning, at last, to stick. The light was going. It was not yet 4 o'clock, and already the day had the dim, underwater quality of deep winter dusk in the hills, and Iris drove slowly, hunched toward the windshield, her headlights catching the snow as it came down through the trees. Eli had gone silent in the back, and when she glanced in the mirror, she saw him holding the compass flat in both palms, watching the needles swing as the road curved, keeping track of which way they were going so that, she understood, they would be able to find their way back. The trees fell away all at once, and there it was. The house stood at the head of a long, overgrown drive, against a sky the color of slate, and even closed up and going to ruin, it stopped the breath in her chest. It was enormous, 3 stories of dark stone and darker timber, gables and a turret, and a long porch sagging across its whole front face, the windows blank and shuttered like closed eyes, the roofline broken here and there where the years had pried up the slate. Snow lay along every ledge and sill and in the deep angles of the eaves. Ivy had climbed the north corner and frozen there, brown and brittle. A wrought iron fence, tall and barbed at the top, ran around the near grounds, the gate standing open and hanging crooked on one hinge. The whole great wreck of it leaned toward them out of the falling snow, vast and patient, and Iris understood in that first moment, in a way no document could have told her, why a woman might come up here at 20-something and never want to leave, and why the rest of the family, looking up the drive at this, might have decided she had lost her mind. "Graham," Eli breathed from the back seat, his face at the glass, the compass forgotten in his lap. "Is that ours? Do we really get to go inside?" "It's ours," Iris said, and her own voice sounded strange to her. "Every stone of it. Lord help us." She drove up the rutted drive, the hatchback bottoming out twice in the frozen ruts, and stopped before the porch. The engine ticked into silence, and the silence that rushed in behind it was total, a silence with no city under it. Only the far low voice of the falls and the hiss of snow on snow, and, somewhere off in the woods, the single dry creak of a tree leaning in the cold. There was a second set of tire tracks in the snow of the drive, already half filled in, and a light, a single yellow light, burning in a downstairs window, and for a moment Iris's heart kicked hard against her ribs before she remembered Marian Pratt, who had turned the heat up and looked in that morning. The light was kindness, not threat. She made herself breathe. They crossed the porch with the duffels and the cooler, the boards groaning and shifting under their boots, snow sifting down through a gap where the porch roof had failed. The front door was oak, 8 feet of it, with 2 long panels of stained glass set into the upper half, and Iris could just make out in the failing light what the glass depicted: a pair of hands, cupped, holding a single point of clear glass that would have caught the morning sun like a held star. She found the key-tagged front, and worked it into the great iron lock, and after a moment of resistance it turned with a heavy, oiled, well-kept sound that did not match the ruin of the porch at all, and the door swung inward into warmth and dust and the smell of 140 years. The flashlight beam went ahead of them into the dark of the hall, and Eli's small hand found the back of her coat and held on. The entry was wide and high, a staircase curving up into shadow, the floor a parquet of dark wood gone dull with dust, but sound underfoot. Furniture stood under white sheets like a gathering of patient ghosts. A chandelier hung above them, the crystal gray with neglect, and when Iris's beam swept across it a few of the lower drops caught the light and threw back, even through the dust, a hard clean rainbow that did not belong in a ruin. To the left, through a wide arch, a parlor. To the right, a room walled floor to ceiling in books. And everywhere, on every surface that her light touched, a fine, even blanket of dust, undisturbed, the dust of years, the dust of a house that had been sealed and left, except for the few rooms downstairs where Marian Pratt had kept the heat on and the worst of the cold at bay. Iris found a switch by the door and tried it, not expecting anything, and was startled when a lamp came on across the parlor, a low amber glow under a fringed shade. The electricity still live as Edwin Rourke had promised. She went room to room on the ground floor, pulling sheets off chairs, turning on lamps, and the house woke around her in pools of old light. The kitchen at the back was 100 years out of date and clean as a pin, and on the scrub table sat a covered dish and a note in a round, careful hand. "Welcome." I made up the back bedroom and put the heat on.
Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. There's a chicken and bread and what you'll need for the morning in the icebox. I'll come by tomorrow once the road's clear. Marian. Beneath the kindness of it, Iris felt her eyes sting, the simple animal relief of arriving cold and frightened to a warm place where someone had thought of her, and she had to stand still a moment at the kitchen table and let it pass. They ate at one end of a dining table built to seat 16, just the two of them, the boy tearing into a chicken leg with both hands and his eyes going everywhere, up to the dim ceiling, down the long, dark gallery of the room, out into the snow at the black windows. Afterward, Iris washed the 2 plates in the deep stone sink while Eli explored the near rooms with the flashlight, calling back his discoveries the way he did: a real piano, Graham, a whole room of plants all dead, a clock as tall as you. And she let him, because the house, for all its ruin, did not feel unsafe. It felt held. It felt, she would have said if anyone had asked, like a house that had been waiting and was glad, in its slow stone way, that someone had finally come. She tucked the boy into the made-up bed in the warm back room a little before 9, and he was asleep before she finished, the compass in his fist, his face gone soft and young the way it only did in sleep. She left the door cracked and a lamp burning low, and she went back through the house alone with the flashlight and the ring of keys and the cream envelope in her coat pocket. On her way, she passed a door tagged in Cora's faded ink as the study, and because the key was on the ring, and because something tugged at her to look, she let herself in. It was a small room off the library, a desk set beneath a shuttered window, the walls shelved to the ceiling, the air cold and unmoving. Her light slid across the desk and found, laid out square on the blotter as though it had been set there for her too, a plain manila folder gone soft at the corners with years of handling. On the tab, in the strong brown hand she was learning to know, was written one word: Iris. She opened it on the cold desk, and her own life looked back at her. A yellowed clipping first, a single column cut clean from the city paper more years ago than she cared to count. A small notice about Adler's and the woman at the repair counter who could date a diamond by the angle of its cut, with a grainy photograph of Iris at 30-something bent over a loop. Beneath it, Walt's obituary, folded once, the creases worn pale. Beneath that, Hannah's, and Iris had to stop and set her hand flat on the wood and make herself breathe, because she had not braced for finding her daughter's death waiting in a dead stranger's study in the hills. There was more under that. A bulletin from Hannah's funeral that Iris had no memory of sending anywhere. And at the bottom, a photograph, blurred and taken from some distance, of Iris on a city sidewalk holding a small boy's hand, the two of them caught mid-stride, not knowing they had been seen. The boy was Eli.
It had been taken sometime in the last 2 years, after Hannah, after the bottom fell out of everything, by some person Iris had never once noticed, on a street 3 hours south of this room. For a moment, the cold finger came back to the nape of her neck, the plain animal sense of having been watched. But it did not feel like the watching of the strangers from the city, the lawyers with their figure read flat off a board. It felt like the long, patient attention of a very old woman with no one left in the world, keeping the only file she had on the only family she had, following at a distance a life she had decided, for reasons Iris could not yet see, mattered to her more than her own. At the very bottom, beneath all of it, lay a torn half-sheet with a single line on it in Cora's hand, undated. She has the hands. I knew at the moment I read the notice. She has my mother's hands, and mine. The rest can be taught. The hands cannot. Iris read it 3 times in the dark and did not understand it, and folded the half-sheet back where it had lain, and felt the great house settle around her with a low groan, as though it had turned over in its sleep, and she went back out into the hall. She came at last to the foot of the great curving stair and looked up into the dark of the second floor, and beyond it, just visible, the foot of a narrower stair climbing into the third. Every reasonable part of her said go to bed. Read the letter in the morning. You are 68 years old, and you have driven 3 hours through a snowstorm into a ruin, and whatever is here will still be here when the sun comes up. But the oldest part of her, the part that had made men wait 3 days, was wide awake and humming, and it had been humming since Edwin Rourke said $400,000, cash, sight unseen. A stranger does not offer a fortune for paste. The worthless thing is not the thing. And somewhere in this house, a woman she had never met had left her a letter sealed with 2 cupped hands, and had said the house would explain the letter, and the letter would explain the house. And Iris found she could not wait until morning to begin to be told. She climbed. The stairs did not creak. Like the lock, they had been kept, oiled and tight, in a house that elsewhere was falling down, and that wrongness, the soundness in the middle of the ruin, was its own kind of clue. She passed the door of the room where the boy slept and felt the fierce low pull of him, the whole reason for everything. And she went on down the second-floor hall, her light sliding over closed doors and faded paper, until she came to the foot of the third stair, steeper and narrower than the rest, and at the top of it a door, and on the door, mounted in tarnished brass, a single word. Private. She tried the small key first, the one with the 2 cupped hands wrought into its head, the one with no tag. It turned with a soft click that seemed very loud in the sleeping house, and the door swung inward, and cold dry air rolled out to meet her, carrying the smell of old wood and paper and something else underneath, a faint mineral coolness, the smell of stone kept in the dark. Beyond the door, a room. Not an attic of trunks and ghosts, as she had half expected, but a workroom, a study, kept and ordered and thick with the only deep dust she had seen upstairs, the dust of a place even Marian Pratt had never been let into. A long bench ran beneath a shuttered dormer window, and on it, laid out in their racks the way a surgeon lays out instruments, were the tools of a trade Iris knew in her own hands before her mind caught up. Gravers and files and a jeweler's saw, a row of tiny pliers, a polishing motor gone gray with dust, and a loop, an old steel loop on a stand, exactly like the one she had bent over a counter for 31 years. Her breath caught. Cora Ashgrove had been a jeweler. Whatever else she had been, she had sat at this bench in the dark of the hills and worked stones with her hands, the same hands that, 68 years ago, had cupped a single point of light into a disk of red wax. Shelves lined the walls, and on the shelves, ledgers. Dozens of them, leather-bound, ranked by year, their spines stamped in gilt gone dull. And on the bench, set square in the center of a clean cloth as though it had been left there deliberately for someone to find, was a small wooden box, and propped against the box, an envelope, cream paper, the twin of the one in Iris's pocket, with a single word written on it in that same strong brown hand. Begin. Iris set down her flashlight on the bench so its beam threw the room into long shadow, and with hands that were not entirely steady she opened the box. Inside, nested in a bed of dark velvet that the years had not faded, lay a single stone. It was not large, no bigger than the nail of her smallest finger, but when her light touched it the thing did something Iris had seen perhaps 3 times in 31 years behind a counter, something paste cannot do and glass cannot do, and only one substance on the earth has ever done. It took the white beam of the flashlight and broke it and gave it back in fire. A clean, hard rainbow flung up onto the shadowed ceiling, blue and gold, and a deep, impossible red, the very red of the wax, the red of two cupped hands holding a held star. It was a diamond, a colored diamond, cut in a style her eye dated to the middle of the last century. And even alone, even in the dark, even in the trembling hand of a woman about to lose her house, it was without any question at all the single, most beautiful thing Iris Caldwell had ever held. And as she stood there with the cold fire of it dancing on the ceiling, she understood two things at once, the way you understand things in the moment your life turns over. The first was that this was one stone, one small stone, and behind her on the wall were 60 years of ledgers, and somewhere in this kept and ordered room there would be more, because no one sets out a single stone and a note that says begin unless the single stone is only the door. And the second thing, the thing that put the cold finger back on the nape of her neck and made her glance, suddenly, toward the shuttered black window and the snow and the dark drive below, was the memory of Edwin Rourke folding his trembling hands and saying that a stranger from the city had offered $400,000, cash, sight unseen, for a house everyone swore was worthless, and that the worthless thing is never the thing. Somebody already knew. Somebody had been writing letters and making calls for a year, waiting for the heir to surface. And Iris Caldwell, alone in a ruin in the hills with a sleeping child 2 floors below and a single burning stone in her open hand, was no longer at all certain that she and the boy were the only 2 people in the world who knew that the door had finally, after 70 years, come open. For a long moment Iris did not move. The single stone burned on in its bed of dark velvet, and the cold fire of it climbed the shadowed ceiling and held there, and she stood with the open box in her 2 hands and let the truth of what she was looking at arrive the way you let very hot water arrive, an inch at a time, so it does not scald you all at once. In 31 years behind the counter at Adler's, she had handled perhaps a dozen real stones of any size, because people did not carry such things into a corner shop on Sumner and 3rd. And this one, small as the nail of her smallest finger, was finer than all 12 of those together. A natural color, deep and even, the kind the trade would call fancy and the rest of the world would simply call impossible. A cut she would have placed in the middle of the last century, made by a hand that knew, to the half degree, exactly what it was reaching for. Until that moment, she had not let herself believe in the $400,000 the strangers from the city had offered. Now, with the fire dancing on the ceiling and her own breath loud in the cold, she believed it, and she understood, with a sinking certainty, that the $400,000 had never been the true measure of anything at all. She set the box down on the bench with great care, the way you set down something that might wake, and she took up the envelope propped against it, the one with the single word written across the front in that strong brown hand. Begin. She worked her thumb under the flap, and the old wax cracked clean, and she unfolded a single sheet covered edge to edge in Cora's writing. If you are reading this, the letter said, then you climbed the stairs your first night in the house, which means you are the one I hoped you were. The ones who can wait until morning are not the ones who can carry this. I left the stone in the box because a woman who has been poor a long while will not let herself believe in a fortune until she is holding one, and I needed you to believe me before you saw the rest. That stone is the smallest thing I own. The bench you are standing at is not the work. The work is behind it. Put your hand where the 2 hands are carved into the paneling, low and to the right of the window, and press, and the wall will give. Everything beyond it is in order. Everything is written down. When you have seen all of it, and not 1 minute before, read the long letter, the one Edwin gave you, and I will tell you how it came to be mine, and how it was taken from me, and the one thing I could never make myself do about it for 60 years. That part belongs to you now. God forgive me, I think it always did. Iris read it twice. Then she lifted her flashlight from the bench and turned it on the paneling below the shuttered window, low and to the right. And there, worked into the dark old wood so plainly that the eye slid past it, was the carving she had seen in the wax and in the stained glass of the front door and in the head of the small key. 2 hands, cupped, holding between them a single-faceted point. She set her palm against it, the way the letter said, and she pressed, and something inside the wall let go with a soft, heavy sound. A counterweight turning over, and a whole section of paneling swung in toward her on a hinge she would never have found in 100 years of looking. Behind it was a room. Not a closet and not a hole in the wall, but a proper small chamber, windowless, lined floor to ceiling in cedar, and from somewhere in its dark came a low, steady hum that she placed after a moment as a dehumidifier, running still, drawing the damp out of the air, because the electricity was live and Cora had set the thing going and no one had ever come to switch it off. The air that rolled out was dry and cool and smelled of cedar and metal, and the deep mineral coolness of stone kept in the dark. Iris stepped across the threshold, and her flashlight found a bank of shallow drawers built into the far wall, the kind a jeweler keeps his trays in, 24 of them, each with a small pull worked in the shape of those same two hands. She slid the top drawer open, and the breath went out of her. It was a tray of finished work, laid in fitted velvet, and the first piece her light fell on was a necklace, a band of graduated stones that ran from the size of a pea at the throat to the size of a thumbnail at the front, every one of them a blue, a true natural blue, the rarest and most longed-for color there is, set in the cradling cupped settings she had now seen 4 times tonight in wax and wood and glass. The settings held each stone up to the light on a little open frame, almost on the fingertips of metal, so that nothing crowded the fire of it, and Iris, who had cleaned 10,000 pieces and set a few hundred stones in her life, looked at the engineering of those settings and felt the hair rise on her arms, because she had never seen anything so right. Whoever had made this had not merely been good. Whoever had made this had been one of the great ones, and had made it in secret, in the dark of the hills, for no buyer and no name and no eye but her own. She opened the next drawer, and the next. A brooch shaped like a long comet, the head a single pink stone the warm color of the inside of a shell, the tail a sweep of small white diamonds. A pair of earrings, each holding a yellow the color of held sunlight. Rings, a dozen of them, every one set with a stone Iris would have sworn could not be natural until she put the loop to it. And then she did put the loop to it, the old steel loop from the bench, and she bent over the tray in the cedar dark and looked, and they were natural, every one, clean and deep and alive. There were pieces here that belonged behind glass in the great houses of the world. There were pieces here, she understood slowly, that the world believed it had already seen, in the windows and the velvet cases of a name everyone knew, and she did not yet understand why she felt so certain of that, only that she did. At the bottom of the bank of drawers was a deeper compartment, and inside it a steel box, and inside the box, wrapped each in its own small fold of soft paper, the loose stones. Cora's hoard. 60 years of it. Iris unwrapped them on the velvet under the lamp she found and switched on, a jeweler's lamp, cool and white, and they made a scatter of slow fire across the cloth, blues and pinks and yellows, and a clear pale green like deep water, dozens of them, each one wrapped and labeled in Cora's hand with a weight and a date going back through the decades. And at the very bottom of the steel box, wrapped not in white paper, but in a square of dark red silk, was one more, set apart from all the rest. And when Iris unfolded the silk and her light touched the thing inside it, she had to put her hand on the bench to keep her feet. It was red, a diamond, several carats of it, cut in the cupped old style, and it was red, the deep clean red of arterial blood, of the wax on the letters, of the held star in the front door glass. She had read about such stones the way you read about comets, things that came once in a generation and went to kings. There were fewer than 40 true red diamonds known in all the world. She was holding one in the palm of her hand in a cedar room in a ruin in the hills, and she understood, looking at it, that this was the thing the strangers from the city had been writing their polite letters about for a year, and that no one offers $400,000, cash, sight unseen, for paste, and no one ever had. She did not add it all up that first night. She could not have, but the ledgers were there on a shelf inside the cedar room, ranked by decade, and she opened the most recent one with hands that would not hold quite steady, and she found that Cora had done the adding for her. Every piece, every stone, each one entered in the strong hand with its weight and its cut and its source, and pasted beside many of them. On the heavy stock such things are printed on, the appraisal certificates, some of them 30 and 40 years old, some of them more recent, each one signed by a name in the trade that even Iris from her corner shop had heard spoken with respect. And on the last written page of the last ledger, beneath a line that Cora had ruled across the paper with care, was a single figure, totaled and dated less than 2 years before her death, written in ink and underscored twice. $470 million. Iris sat down on the jeweler's stool in the cedar dark with the red stone wrapped again in its silk in her closed fist, and she did not weep, though she had thought she might, and she did not laugh, though that felt nearer. She sat very still while the dehumidifier hummed, and the great ruined house slept around her, and the boy slept 2 floors below with his grandfather's compass in his hand, and she let the number sit in the room with her like a third person, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that the bank could keep its house now, that the apartments by the medical center could keep their voucher, that Eli would have whatever a child could be given, and that none of it, not 1 cent of it, felt yet like good news. It felt like a weight settling onto her, the same weight the letter on the bench had promised. Everything is documented, Cora had written. That part belongs to you now. She remembered then the long sealed letter in her coat pocket, the one Edwin Rourke had pressed on her in his warm, cramped office, the one Cora had been so fierce that no one read until the house had been seen. When you have seen all of it, the note on the bench had said, and not 1 minute before, read the long letter, and I will tell you how it came to be mine, and how it was taken. Iris had seen it now. She drew the cream envelope out of her pocket, and she broke the red wax of the 2 cupped hands, and under the cool white jeweler's lamp, in the cedar room with $470 million laid in trays around her, she read the story her great had waited 60 years and her own whole death to tell. The hand was strong at the start and grew, over many pages, smaller and more pressed, as though the telling cost her something she had to ration. Cora had been born in this house, she wrote, in the autumn of 1929, in the same week the markets fell, and took the last of the family money with them, so that she grew up in a great house with a famous name and not enough coal to heat the 3rd floor. Her mother had the hands. That was how the family had said it for 3 generations, the way other families say someone has a good ear or a head for figures. Her mother could take a rough stone and a loop and a graver and find the life inside the stone the way a sculptor finds the figure in the marble, and she taught Cora at this very bench, in this very room, before Cora was 10 years old, because there was nothing left to leave the girl but the only thing that could not be lost in a market, which was what was in her hands. She had gone to the city at 20, in 1949, with her mother's tools and her mother's eye and a portfolio of designs she had drawn herself, and she had met, that first winter, a young man named Leland Crane. Iris read his name and felt the cold come back to the nape of her neck. He had everything she did not, Cora wrote, and she had the one thing he never would. He had a way with a room and a way with a wealthy woman across a counter and a way of making a man believe that to own a thing of beauty was to become a finer man himself. He could sell, and she could make. He had no eye at all, not really. He could not have told a fine stone from a good one in a dark room, but he knew how to stand next to beauty and let a little of it fall on him. And he was charming. God, he was charming, and she was 20 years old and alone in a cold city, and she loved him almost from the first. They opened a little shop together on a good street in 1951, and they put both their names over the door. Ashgrove and Crane. She had drawn the lettering herself. The designs were hers. All of them. The cupped settings that held a stone up on the fingertips of the metal so nothing crowded its fire. The line of work that within a few short years had collectors waiting and the better magazines writing and the door of the little shop opening on a people who had never set foot on that street before. All of it had come off this bench in her hand. And she had been glad to give it to him, she wrote, because she had believed they were building one thing together, a name and a house and a life, and that it did not matter whose hand drew the line so long as the line was theirs. That was the mistake. That was the whole of the mistake, and it took her years to see the size of it. He had been putting the papers in his own name the entire time. Cora had not been raised to read a contract, and there had been no one to read it for her, and Leland had been patient and unhurried, the way a certain kind of man is patient when he already knows how a thing will end. By 1955 he had registered the designs, every one of them, as the sole work of Leland Crane. He had taken on a backer, a man with a great deal of money and a daughter, and Leland had married the daughter in the spring of that year, and the backer's money had bought out the lease and the stock and the very tools, all but her mother's, which Cora had kept only because she happened to have them at home the week the locks were changed. When she went to the men of the law, they were courteous, and they explained to her, as though to a child, that the papers were the papers, that her name on the door had been a sentiment and not a deed, that she had drawn the designs as an employee of the firm whether she had understood herself to be one or not, and that there was nothing, in the year 1955, that a young woman with talent and no money and no standing could do about any of it at all. He kept the firm. He kept the backer's money and the backer's daughter. He took her name off the door and left his own, and within 10 years the House of Crane was a name spoken in the same breath as the oldest and grandest in the trade, built stone by stone on a line of designs that had come off this bench in the hand of a woman the world would never hear of. Iris stopped reading. She set the pages down on her knee in the cedar room and looked at the trays of blue and pink and yellow fire around her, the finished pieces, and she understood at last why she had felt so sure, drawer after drawer, that the world believed it had already seen this work. It had. It had seen it in the windows of the House of Crane, on the necks and hands of the famous and the rich, for 70 years. Only it had seen it under the wrong name. She picked the letter back up. The rest of it was the 60 years. Cora had come home to Ashgrove, and she had made 2 vows. She wrote, both of them in this room, the winter she came back. The first was that she would keep the proof. She had kept everything. Her original drawings, dated and witnessed, predating every registration Leland ever filed. The early correspondence in which he praised the designs as hers before it became convenient to forget. The little appointment books from the shop in her own hand. The prototypes she had carried home that last week, which were the true first castings of the line the whole world now called Crane. All of it was here, she wrote, in the long flat case beneath the bottom drawer, and any honest expert who looked at it for 1 hour would know to a certainty whose hand had made the House of Crane. The second vow was harder and took her whole life. She would buy back the work, piece by piece, stone by stone, at the auctions and the estate sales and the discreet private sales where such things change hands. She would gather what was hers, the materials she had loved and been denied, and she would cut and set them on this bench in her own designs, finer than anything she had ever let Leland sell, for no buyer and no name and no eye but her own and her God's. It had taken 60 years and every cent the house and land ever made her, and she had done it. The $470 million was the measure of it. The red stone was the crown of it. She had bought the red the year she turned 80, she wrote, at a sale in another country, under a name that was not hers, and she had cut it herself, here, with her mother's tools in her own old hands, and it was the last great thing she ever made. And she had never gone to war. That was the part she had to ration the ink to write. She had kept the proof for 60 years and never once carried it into the light, because she was one woman, and then she was an old woman, and the House of Crane had grown into a thing beloved by the whole world, with its own museum and its own century of advertisements and its armies of men of the law. And what was she against that? A recluse in a falling house with a story no one wanted to hear and the look, she knew, of a bitter old woman who could not let an old hurt go. She had told herself, year after year, that keeping it safe was enough, that preserving the truth in a cedar room was the same as honoring it. And she had known, in her last years, that this had been the largest lie of her whole life, larger than any Leland ever told, because keeping a true thing locked in the dark where it can do no good is its own kind of theft, and she had committed it against the truth itself, with her own 2 hands, for 60 years, out of nothing finer than fear. I am ashamed of that, Cora wrote, near the end, where the hand was smallest, not of being robbed. A person cannot help being robbed by someone she trusts. I am ashamed of the 60 years I sat on the proof and did nothing, and called my cowardice preservation, and let a lie wear my work like a borrowed coat and call itself the finest house in the world. I could not finish it. I want you to understand that I tried, more than once, to pick up that long flat case and drive it down to the city and set it on a desk and let the war begin, and every time I could not, because I was afraid, and then because I was old, and then because I was dying. So I have done the one thing left to a coward. I have kept it all in order, and I have waited for someone with the hands and the spine I had only one of. Iris read the last page by the cool white lamp. I found you years ago, Cora wrote, in a notice in a city paper about a corner shop and the woman at the repair counter who could date a diamond by the angle of its cut. I read that and I knew. She has the hands. I knew it the way my mother knew it about me. I have followed you since, from a distance, the way an old woman with no one follows the only blood she has, and I have watched the world take from you the way it took from me, the husband, the daughter, and now the house. I could have written to you while I lived. I was a coward to the last, and I did not. But I have left you everything, and I have left you the choice I never had the spine to make. You may sell it. Every cent is yours, and you are days from losing your home. And there is not one soul on this earth who would think the worse of you for taking the money and walking away and never wanting again. If you do that, I will not blame you from wherever I am. You will only be doing what I did, keeping the secret, and you will be the kinder for at least letting the money do some good. But there is another road, and it is the one I could not take, and I am putting it in your hands because I think your hands are stronger than mine ever were. You can give the truth its day. You can carry that long, flat case into the light and make the House of Crane answer for what it took, and put the name Ashgrove back beside the work where it has belonged for 70 years. The proof is there. The war will be ugly, and they will say terrible things about you and about me, and you will be one woman against a great house, exactly as I was. But you will not be 20, and you will not be alone, because you will have the boy, and the boy deserves a grandmother who is not afraid. And then a last line, set apart, the ink pressed hard. If a Crane ever comes up that drive, then the war has already begun, and you will have to decide, faster than I ever could, whether you are a keeper of secrets or a teller of the truth. Decide better than I did. Cora. Iris folded the pages along their old creases and held them in her lap in the cedar room, and outside the shuttered window the first hard freeze of the year came down over the hills and locked the ground. And she sat with $470 million and a dead woman's confession and a red stone the color of blood in the dark, and for the first time in 8 months she did not feel afraid. She felt chosen, which was a different and a heavier thing. Before she let herself sleep, she found the proof. Cora had told her where it lay, in the letter, beneath the bottom drawer, and Iris knelt on the cedar floor and slid the bottom drawer all the way off its runners and set it aside, and in the cavity beneath it was a shallow steel case as long as her arm, latched but not locked. She lifted it onto the bench and opened it under the white lamp. Inside, between sheets of the soft, acid-free paper the trade uses to keep paper from going yellow, were the drawings. Cora's own hand, pencil and ink, sheet after sheet of them, the cupped settings worked out in careful elevation and section, the whole famous line of the House of Crane drawn here in its first life. And in the corner of every sheet, a date, and beside the date a second signature, a witness, and a notary's seal pressed hard into the paper, going back to 1950 and 1951 and 1952, years before any registration Leland Crane ever filed under his own name alone. She had had them witnessed at the time. A young woman who could not read a contract had still known, somehow, to take her own drawings to a man of the law and have them dated and stamped, as though some animal part of her had smelled, even while she was in love, exactly what was coming for her. Beneath the drawings lay the little appointment books from the shop in her writing, and beneath those, wrapped each in cloth, the prototypes themselves, the true first castings, rougher than the finished pieces in the trays above, but plainly their parents, the originals out of which a whole grand house had been raised under another name. Iris laid one dated drawing beside one finished necklace, the design of 1951 next to its realization 70 years on, both off the same hand, and she looked from the one to the other under the lamp for a long time. Edwin Rourke had said one thing in his warm, cramped office that she knew now she would carry into whatever was coming. The worthless thing is never the thing. And Cora had written one thing she would carry beside it. Any honest expert who looks at this for 1 hour will know, to a certainty, whose hand made the House of Crane. The proof was not a grievance or a story or a bitter old woman's grudge. It was here, dated and stamped and lying open on the bench under her hands, and it had been here in the dark for 60 years, waiting on someone with the spine to carry it down out of the hills and into the light. She slept 3 hours on a daybed she found pushed against the cedar room's inner wall, under a quilt that smelled of her great-aunt, and she woke to gray light at the seams of the shutters and the sound of a vehicle on the frozen drive. For one cold instant the whole night before felt like a thing she had dreamed, And then she remembered the trays, and the red stone, and the line about a crane coming up the drive, and she was on her feet and at the dormer with her heart going hard before she had her wits about her. She worked one shutter open a crack. Below, in the iron morning, an old pickup had pulled up short of the porch, and a woman was climbing out of it in a heavy coat. A woman of perhaps 65 with iron-colored hair under a wool cap and a grocery box balanced on one hip. And Iris let her breath go all at once, because she knew before the woman looked up that this was Marian Pratt, who had turned the heat on and left the chicken and the note, who had kept this house for a recluse for years and had no idea. Iris was suddenly certain of what was sealed 2 floors above the kitchen where she set down her box. She came downstairs and let Marian in, and the 2 women stood in the front hall and took each other's measure the way country people do, plainly and without hurry. Marian Pratt had a weathered square face and pale steady eyes and the kind of hands that had carried other people's loads a long time. And when she set down the grocery box and took Iris's hand, she held it a beat longer than a stranger would and said, "So you're the one." I wondered who it would turn out to be. She never would say, only that there was someone and that I'd know when they came. She looked Iris over once more, and something in her face eased. "You've got the look of her around the eyes. Did you find her things all right? The bench and all? She'd want you to have her tools." "I found them," Iris said, and left it there, and Marian Pratt did not press, which told Iris a good deal about why Cora Ashgrove had trusted this woman for years. They made coffee in the old kitchen while Eli slept on, and Marian talked, the way a person talks who has held quiet a long time for someone who is gone. She had come twice a week for 19 years, she said. She had done the shopping and looked in on the pipes and read to Cora the last few winters when the old woman's eyes went. And Cora had never once let her pass the second floor, and Marian had never once asked, because everyone in the hills had something they kept to themselves, and that was Cora's right. She'd been a hard woman to know and a fair one to work for, Marian said, sharp as a tack to the very end and not the least bit soft, and lonely. Lord, lonely in a way that frightened you to be near sometimes. A woman who had walled herself up with something that ate at her for 60 years and would not let it go and would not say what it was. She kept a folder on you, Marian said, and looked at Iris over the rim of her cup. I know because I'm the one mailed off for some of what's in it. Obituaries and the like. She'd hear a thing and have me send away for the paper. I always wondered who you were to her. Family, I figured. She didn't have any that came. Marian set her cup down. She told me one thing, near the end, that I didn't understand, and I'll tell you in case you do. She said, if a man ever comes up that drive in a fine car and offers you money for the house, you turn him around at the gate and you call Edwin Rourke that same hour, because it'll mean the wolves have got the scent. Those were her words. The wolves have got the scent. Marian's pale eyes held Iris's. There's been a car, twice this past year, parked down the Falls Road where the old logging cut comes in, where you'd not see it unless you knew the road. Out of county plates. Sat there an hour each time and left. I told Edwin. He said to mind it and say nothing, so I minded it. She paused. I expect that means something to you, the way you've gone still. It means something, Iris said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. It means my great-aunt was right about everything, which I'm starting to think she usually was. The man came up the drive that afternoon. Iris had been half expecting him since Marian spoke. And so when the long dark car came up the frozen ruts a little after 2 o'clock, gleaming and out of place against the gray ruin of the place, she felt the cold drop through her, but she did not feel surprised. She had Eli at the kitchen table with crayons and a coloring book Marian had brought, and Marian herself was still there, drying the lunch plates, and Iris was glad of both of them, the woman and the child, the way you are glad of solid ground. She watched through the front window as the car stopped and a driver came around to open the rear door, and a man stepped out into the cold in a charcoal overcoat that had been made for him by someone who was paid well to make it, and stood for a moment looking up at the great dark front of the house with an expression Iris could not read at that distance, but which she would later decide had been something close to hunger. He was perhaps 60, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had spent a lifetime being trusted across a counter and a boardroom table, handsome in a managed way, and when Iris opened the front door but left the chain on, he smiled at her through the gap with a warmth so practiced it was almost convincing. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. My name is Damien Crane. I believe our attorneys have written to Mr. Rourke about this property once or twice. I was in the region, and I thought it was past time I came myself and met the woman who's inherited it, rather than hiding behind letters. May I come in? It's bitter out here. Crane. He had said the name with no weight at all, as though it were any name, and watched her face while he said it, and Iris understood that he was reading her the way she read a stone, looking for the flaw, looking to learn from her eyes how much she knew. She kept her face shut. It's a long way to come to look at a house you've never seen, Mr. Crane, she said. Your lawyers offered $400,000 for it without ever setting foot inside. That's a great deal of money for a ruin. I've been wondering all week why. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of recalculation, and the smile held but changed underneath. May I be candid? I think you've earned candor. My family's firm has a long history, and your great-aunt was, very briefly, a small part of its earliest days, before my grandfather built it into what it became. There are sentimental objects, papers, a few early pieces that we believe may still be somewhere in this house, things of no real value to anyone but us, but of great value to our archive, our heritage. We would simply like to be sure they're preserved properly, in the right hands. The $400,000 was never about the house, Mrs. Caldwell. You're quite right. It was about laying that old chapter to rest, respectfully, and sparing you the trouble of a property you can't possibly want to keep. He spread his gloved hands, the picture of reason. I know your situation. Forgive me, I do. I know the house and the city, the bank, the boy you're raising on your own. I'm not here to take advantage of that. I'm here because I think I can solve it. Let me take this place and these old family papers off your hands, and let me do it generously. Not $400,000. I came prepared to say $2 million, today, into your account by Monday morning. The house, the contents, all of it as is. You walk away from every worry you have, and a difficult old story finally finds its peace. $2 million. Iris heard Marian go still behind her at the sink. She heard Eli's crayon stop. $2 million was more money than she had ever held in her mind as a real number, and it would have ended every fear she had, the bank and the boy and all of it. And a year ago, a week ago, before the cedar room and the letter, she might have signed anything he put in front of her and called herself lucky. But she had read Cora's letter in the dark, and she had held the red stone, and she had added up the figure ruled twice in ink, and she stood at her own front door with the chain on and looked at this gracious, generous, smiling man and understood exactly what he was. He was offering her $2 million for $470 million and a proof that could bring his whole house down, and he was calling it kindness, and he did not know yet that she knew the difference, and she decided, in that moment, not to tell him. That's very generous, she said, and made her voice small and tired, an old woman in over her head, because she had learned a thing or two about men who underestimate women across a counter. It's a lot to take in. I only got here Saturday. I haven't even been through the house, not really. It's all dust and sheets up there. She let her eyes go vague. I'd have to think, and I'd have to ask Mr. Rourke. I don't sign things I don't understand, Mr. Crane. My nephew's always after me about that. The relief that crossed his face was the most honest thing he had shown her, and it told her everything. He thought she was exactly what she was pretending to be. Of course, he said warmly. Of course you must think, and you must take advice. That's only prudent. I'd expect nothing less. He drew a card from inside the charcoal coat and held it through the gap in the door, heavy stock, engraved, the name of the house she had seen in 100 windows. But let me say one thing, gently, because I'd be doing you no kindness to leave it unsaid. A collection like the one your great-aunt may have assembled, if she assembled anything, is a complicated thing to own. There are questions of where things came from, of how they were acquired, of whether they can be sold at all, legally, by someone with no standing in the trade and no records. People in your position, with respect, can find themselves the target of claims, of audits, of a great deal of expensive and frightening attention they are in no way equipped to handle, and they can lose everything, the money and their peace and more, fighting a war they never understood they'd started. He smiled, and the smile did not warm the cold that had come into the rest of him. I can make all of that simply not happen. That's what I'm offering, truly. Not just money. Safety. I'd think very hard, Mrs. Caldwell, before turning down safety, for yourself and for the boy. He glanced past her, just once, to the table where Eli sat with his crayon stopped in his hand and his still dark eyes fixed on the stranger at the door, and then back to her. And the glance had been brief and deliberate, and Iris felt it go through her like cold water. "Call me," he said. "Soon. The offer won't be on the table forever, and the wolves, as I'm sure your great aunt's housekeeper could tell you, do get impatient." He went back down the steps, and the driver opened the door for him, and the long dark car turned in the frozen drive and went back down the Falls Road into the trees, and Iris stood at her own front door with the chain still on and the engraved card in her hand and her heart slamming. And behind her Marian Pratt set down the dish towel and said, "Lo." He looked at the boy. "He did," Iris said. "On purpose." "Yes." Iris closed the door and slid the bolt, the old iron bolt that would not stop anyone who truly wanted in, and turned around. And there was Eli watching her with his serious, frightened face, and she crossed the kitchen and knelt down and took his face in her two hands the way she always did. "That was nobody, baby. A man who wants something we have. He's not getting it, and he's not coming back inside this house, and you and me are fine. You understand? We're fine. We're good at this." He had a mean smile, Eli said. It was smiley, but his eyes weren't. "You see good," Iris told him, and meant it, and thought of a folder with a torn half-sheet in it, and a line in a strong brown hand. She has the hands. The hands cannot be taught. Maybe the eye couldn't either. Maybe it ran in the blood, down through Cora's mother and Cora and Iris and on into this small grave boy. The gift of seeing a true thing for what it was and a false one for what it was. And if so, then Damian Crane had walked into the one house in the world where the smile would never work. She drove down to the spot on the Falls Road where Marian said the signal sometimes caught, with Eli buckled in the back and the doors locked, and she stood by the car in the cold with her phone held up to the gray sky until 2 bars flickered, and she called Edwin Rourke first and told him a crane had come up the drive and offered $2 million. And the old lawyer was silent for a moment and then said, in a voice gone careful and grim, "Then it has started, exactly as she always said it. Wood, you did right not to sign. Come down to the office tomorrow and we'll talk about what you have and what you mean to do with it, because there are only 2 roads from here, Mrs. Caldwell, and they go very different places." She said she would. Then, because she had told him she would not sign things she did not understand, and because that was true, she called Dale. He answered on the second ring, and his voice had changed. She heard it before he said 3 words, the new careful brightness in it, and she understood that the world had already begun to move. "And Iris," he said, "thank God. I've been trying you all day. There's no signal up there. Where are you? Listen, I owe you an apology. All right, I do. I said some things about the house, about the $100, and I was wrong. I was completely wrong, and I want you to know I'm here for you now, whatever you need." A breath. "A man called me. A lawyer, down in the city, said he represented a party interested in the estate. He knew I was your nephew, Aunt Iris, I don't know how, and he was asking about you, about whether you were, his word, equipped to manage something of significant value, whether the family had any concerns about he said your capacity, given everything you've been through this year. And he mentioned, real casual, that there might be a finder's arrangement for a family member who helped things go smoothly. Aunt Iris, what is up there? What did Aunt Cora leave you? Because grown men with city law firms do not call the insurance nephew in the middle of the afternoon over a ruined house worth nothing." So that was the shape of it. Iris stood by the car in the freezing dusk with the phone cold against her ear and felt something in her go very still and very clear, the way it used to go when a man set a ring on her counter and asked her to tell him the truth about it. Damian Crane had not waited to be turned down. He had already gone around her, to the bank, to the nephew, to her capacity, the same word the grief counselor had used about Tom Brennan in a story she had never heard, the same word Dale himself had reached for in her kitchen a week ago. And the House of Crane had spent 70 years learning that you do not buy a thing like this, you take it. And the cheapest way to take it from one old woman is to make the world agree she was never fit to keep it. They would say she was confused. They would say she was a poor old woman and over her head, manipulated, unfit, and they would offer the nephew a cut to say so too. And if Cora Ashgrove had been afraid of exactly this for 60 years, then Cora Ashgrove had been right to be afraid, because here it was, and it had come for Iris before she had owned the place a week. "Dale," Iris said, "I'm going to tell you one thing. and I need you to hear it, because the next while is going to test what kind of man you are." She watched her grandson's small pale face in the back window, watching her through the glass. "Aunt Cora left me the truth about something that a very powerful family stole a long time ago, and they will do anything, say anything, pay anybody, to get it back and bury it, including buying you. So you're going to have to decide whose nephew you are. You can be theirs, and take their money, and tell their lawyers your old aunt's gone soft. Or you can be mine. But you cannot be both, and you have to choose now, tonight, because I am not selling, and I am not folding, and I am not handing that boy or that truth to anybody. And the war Aunt Cora was too afraid to fight for 60 years has just landed on me, and I mean to finish it." The line was quiet a long moment, long enough that she thought the signal had dropped. Then Dale said, in a voice she had not heard from him since he was a boy, "What do you need me to do?" And Iris, standing in the dark in the hills with $470 million sealed 2 floors above her grandson's bed and the wolves already at the gate, found that she was not afraid, and tipped her head back, and gave him the first answer of the war. Monday came up gray and iron cold, and Iris drove down the Falls Road into Hadley Falls with Eli buckled beside her and the long flat steel case of Cora's drawings on the back seat under a blanket, because she was not about to leave the proof alone in a house with no lock worth the name and a crane already at the gate. She had wrapped the red stone in its silk and carried it in her coat pocket against her heart, and she had spent the last of Sunday night not sleeping but thinking, turning Cora's 2 roads over and over, and somewhere before dawn she had stopped turning them, because she already knew which one she was on. She had known, she thought, since the moment Damian Crane glanced at her grandson. Edwin Rourke had the percolator going and a fire in the little gas stove when she came in, and he sent Eli to the corner with the stick of peppermint and a stack of legal pads and a box of colored pencils that suggested the old man had thought ahead, and then he sat Iris down across the desk and told her the truth the way she had asked him to, plainly and without softening it. "There are 2 roads, Mrs. Caldwell, and I want you to hear both before you choose. Because once you choose, there is no coming back to this office and choosing the other." He folded his trembling hands on the blotter. "The first road is the quiet one. You have, by your own account and your great-aunt's records, a collection worth something near $470 million, lawfully yours, free of any lien but the one we settled for $100. You do not have to fight anyone to keep it. You can engage a discreet house, sell it over a year or 2 to private buyers who ask no questions and want their names kept out of the papers as badly as you might. And you can settle your mortgage by the end of the month, secure that boy past the end of his life, and never speak the name Crane again. Damian Crane would prefer you took his $2 million. But if you simply sold elsewhere and stayed silent about how the collection came to be, he would let you alone, because his quarrel is not with your having the stones. His quarrel is only with the truth attached to them. Sell the stones, keep the truth in your pocket, and you will be a rich and a safe old woman, and no one alive will think the worse of you for it." He paused. "That is the road your great-aunt took for 60 years. I watched her take it. I will not pretend it is a coward's road. It is only a quiet one. And the other," Iris said, "the other is war." Rourke did not blink. "If you carry that case into the light, if you stand up and say that the House of Crane, which has a museum and a foundation and a century of advertisements and more lawyers than this county has people, was built on the stolen work of a woman they erased, then they will come for you with everything they have, and the first thing they will come for is you. Not the proof. You. They will say you are a confused old woman, broke, grieving, raising a child you are too old and too poor to raise, manipulated by a dead recluse's grudge. They have already begun. They have already called your nephew in the bank and used the word capacity, which is a lawyer's word, Mrs. Caldwell, and it means they are laying the ground to argue you are not fit to hold what you hold." He let that sit, and his old eyes were kind and unsparing both. "They may try for a conservatorship. They may try to have the court appoint a stranger to manage your affairs for your own good, the way your nephew once wanted to manage them. And if they win that, they win everything, because a managed person signs what she is told to sign. They will buy the note on your house if they can and use the date against you. They will frighten the boy. It will take a year at the least, and it will be ugly past anything in your life, and you will be one woman against a great house, exactly as Cordelia was, and there is a real chance, I will not lie to you, that you will lose, and lose the collection and the truth and your good name altogether. He spread his hands. That is the war. Now, you have heard both, and you are the only person on this earth who gets to choose. Iris looked across the room at Eli, bent over a legal pad with a green pencil, the compass set on the table beside him where he could see it, drawing. She could tell from the careful way he held himself, the great dark house in the hills. Then she looked back at the old lawyer. My whole life, she said, I stood behind a counter and told men the truth about what they had. Some of them didn't want to hear it. A man would bring in his dead mother's ring. Sure, it was worth a fortune, and it would be paste, and I'd have to tell him, and he'd hate me for a minute for telling him. And once in a while it went the other way. A man would bring in a thing he thought was junk, and it would be real and fine, and I'd get to be the one to tell him that too. 31 years, Mr. Rourke, and the one thing I never once did, not for a tip, not for a sale, not to keep a customer happy, was lie about a stone. She took the red diamond out of her pocket and unwrapped it on the blotter, and the fire of it leapt up red in the gray morning light, and the old lawyer drew a slow breath. My great-aunt left me the truth about the finest work I have ever seen, and she left it to me because she'd watched my whole life and decided I had the hands and the spine she only had one of. She told me to decide better than she did. I've been deciding all night, and I've decided. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life rich and quiet, sitting on the truth in a cedar room the way she did, ashamed of it. That's not a life. That's just a nicer cell. She wrapped the stone again. I want the war. I want her name back. I want it on the work, in the light, where it's belonged for 70 years. Tell me what we do first. Edwin Rourke looked at her for a long moment over his glasses, and something old and tired in his face eased, and he said, I have waited 40 years for somebody to sit in that chair and say that. I am 78 years old, Mrs. Caldwell, and a country lawyer, and I cannot fight the House of Crane alone, and I will not pretend I can. But I know who can help us, and so, I think, do you? We need one thing more than anything else before this begins. We need an expert no one can buy and no one can call a liar, who can look at those drawings and those stones and tell the world what they are. Do you know such a person? And Iris did. She had known since the cedar room. There was one man left in the trade she would trust with the truth, the one who had taught her, all those years ago, the difference between a thing that shines and a thing that is real. His name was Sol Brandt, and he was 91 years old, and he had been a gem man for 70 of those years before his hands and his eyes finally made him put down the loop. And when Iris was a girl of 26, just starting at the counter at Adler's, frightened of every stone, it was Sol Brandt who had come through once a season as a traveling appraiser and taken pity on her and taught her, over coffee in the back room, the things that were not in any book. How a natural color sits in a stone different from a treated one. How a cut from before the war catches the light away a modern cut never will. How to tell, in the end, with nothing but your eye and your patience, a true thing from a false one. She had not seen him in 15 years. She found his number through the old shop's wholesaler, who was surprised the old man was still living, and she called him from the spot on the Falls Road where the signal caught, and when she said her name there was a silence, and then a dry old voice said, Iris, the girl with the hands. I always wondered what became of you. And Iris had to stand a moment in the cold before she could go on. He drove up 2 days later. He should not have been driving at all, and his granddaughter had wanted to come instead, but Sol Brandt had heard 3 sentences of what Iris had on her hands, and had said he would crawl up into those hills on his knees before he missed it. And so he came, a tiny ancient man folded into an enormous old sedan, with a loop around his neck on a ribbon and a leather case of tools on the seat beside him that he had not opened in a decade. Iris met him at the gate and helped him out, and he stood in the freezing afternoon looking up at the great dark front of Ashgrove and was silent a long time, and then he said, very low, so this is where she went. Iris turned to him. You knew her. I knew of her. The old man's eyes did not leave the house. Everyone in the trade my age knew of her, the ones who paid attention, which was never many. There was a story, Iris. A whisper 65 years back, when I was a young man going to the sales, that the early Crane line, the cupped settings, the held light pieces, the work that made the house, that it hadn't come from Leland Crane at all, because Leland Crane couldn't draw a circle and everybody who'd met him knew it, that it had come from a partner, a woman, Ashgrove. and that she'd been cut out of it clean, the way they cut women out in those days, papers and lawyers, and a wedding to a backer's daughter, and that she'd gone up into the hills somewhere and never been seen again. He finally looked at Iris. I'll tell you a thing I have not told anyone in 60 years, because I am 91 and there's no one left to be ashamed in front of. I saw her once. At a sale, in the city, must have been 1962 or 3. An old dealer pointed her out to me across the room. A young woman, plain dress, bidding on a piece of the very line she was supposed to have designed, buying back her own work with her own money. And the dealer told me the story, and I was 20-some years old and I thought, somebody ought to do something about that. Somebody ought to help that woman. And then the sale ended and I went home and I did nothing. Because what was it to me? And I have thought about her, Iris, on and off, for 60 years, that young woman buying back her own stolen work in a borrowed dress, and the doing nothing. His old voice cracked. Take me inside. Show me what she made. And then, by God, let me help you do the something I didn't do when I was young enough to do it easy. She took him up to the cedar room, and Sol Brandt put the loop to his old eye. And for 3 hours he went through it all, the trays and the loose stones, and at the last the red. And the small ancient man wept twice and laughed once, and said almost nothing that Iris had not already known in her own hands, which was its own kind of confirmation. The stones were real, every one, natural color, finer than anything in any window in the world. The cut was the old cut, the held-like cut, done by a master. And the value, when he and Iris went through Cora's ledgers and the pasted-in certificates together and Sol added his own old judgment to it, was if anything low. Cora had been conservative. The red alone, he said, the red alone in the right room on the right night would bring $40 million and might bring 60. And there were fewer than 40 of its kind on the earth. And this one was cut by the very hand that the world was about to learn had made the House of Crane. Then she showed him the drawings. Sol Brandt sat at Cora's bench under the white lamp and went through the long steel case sheet by sheet, the dated and witnessed and notarized drawings, 1950 and 1951 and 1952, and the little shop appointment books, and the wrapped prototypes. And when he was done, he sat for a while with his spotted hands flat on the bench, the way Iris's had gone flat on it the first night. And then he said, "There is no argument here, Iris. Do you understand me? There is no case to be made against this. These drawings are dated and stamped by a notary years before Leland Crane registered a single one of those designs in his own name. The prototypes are the first castings. You can see the file marks. You can see her hand learning the setting that the world thinks Crane invented. Any institute, any honest expert, any court in the country that looks at this for one afternoon will reach the same conclusion, and there is nothing the House of Crane can do to make it not so, because the truth is on the paper, and the paper is 60 years older than their lie." He looked up at her. "They know that. That is why your Mr. Crane offered you $2 million and called it kindness. He is not trying to buy a collection. He is trying to buy the only thing that can burn his house down, and he is hoping to get it from a frightened old woman before she finds out what it's worth." The old man's jaw set. "We are not going to let him." But knowing the truth and getting it into the light were different things, and the House of Crane did not wait for them to be ready. It came at Iris in 3 ways at once, the way Rourke had warned her it would, and it came fast. The first was the capacity attack. A petition was filed in the county where Iris's old house stood, by a party styling itself a concerned representative of the family interest, asking the court to look into whether Iris Caldwell, given her recent bereavements, her financial distress, and her sudden removal to an isolated property under the influence of a deceased relative's instructions, was competent to manage an estate of significant value, and asking the court to consider the appointment of a neutral conservator to protect the assets and the minor child in her care. The words minor child in her care were in there on purpose, and Iris read them at Rourke's desk and felt them go through her like a blade, because they were aimed at the one fear she could not reason her way out of. The fear that someone with money and lawyers could decide she was too old and too poor and too sad to keep the boy and take him for his own good. They had found the soft place. They had found it because Crane was good at finding soft places, the way he had found Dale and the bank, and they were pressing on it with everything they had. The second was the note. A representative of the House of Crane, through an intermediary, bought Iris's mortgage from the bank, the whole soured note with its comma in it. and the new holder of the note did not want a reinstatement plan. The new holder of the note wanted the property and sent, within a week, a notice that the sale would proceed on the date set, in 11 days, with no further extensions, no hardship review, nothing. Crane had bought the date. He meant to put Iris out of her home on schedule, not because he wanted a tired house in Easton, but because a woman who has just lost her home in a public auction looks to a court considering her capacity, exactly like a woman who cannot manage her affairs. Every move he made fed the next one. Lose the house, prove the incompetence, take the conservatorship, take the collection, bury the truth, all of it one machine. And the third was the smear, which had not broken yet, but which Iris could feel coming the way you feel weather. Rourke heard from a friend in the city that a reporter at a certain glossy magazine had been making calls, that someone had fed the reporter a story about a reclusive old woman in the hills who had hoarded a collection of jewels of doubtful and possibly criminal provenance, and a niece, broke and unstable, now trying to peddle them, and that the house of Crane, ever the friend of the trade, had grave concerns. They were going to print Cora as a thief and Iris as a fool, and they were going to do it first, before the truth could get its boots on, because Damian Crane had learned in 70 years of running a great house that the world believes the first story it is told, and forgets the correction. It was the break-in that nearly broke her. It came on the 9th night before the foreclosure date, and Iris had been waiting for it without quite letting herself know she was waiting, because Sol had warned her, the morning he left, that men who would buy a note and file a petition would not draw the line at sending someone up a dark road for a steel case. And so Iris had done the one thing Cora never thought to do. The one thing 31 years behind a counter in a city had taught her that 60 years alone in the hills had not. She had not trusted the cedar room. The week Sol came. She and Rourke had taken the long, flat case of drawings, and the appointment books, and the prototypes, and the red stone, and the finest of the loose stones, down to the city, and Sol's Institute had photographed every drawing at high resolution and sealed the originals in the vault of a respectable house under Rourke's name and a number, and copies and a sworn inventory had gone to 3 separate places Crane could not reach. What was left in the cedar room at Ashgrove, behind the false wall, was the bulk of the finished collection, insured now and real and valuable, but not the proof. The proof was gone, sealed and copied and scattered, 11 days before anyone came for it. They came at 2 in the morning. Iris woke to the particular wrongness of a sound that did not belong, a soft splintering from somewhere below, and she was out of bed and down the hall to Eli's door before her mind had caught up with her body, and she stood in the dark hallway with her hand on the boy's door and her heart slamming and listened to men, 2 of them by the weight of the steps, move through the downstairs of her great aunt's house. She did not have a gun. She did not have a phone that worked in this house. She had a sleeping 8-year-old and a flashlight and the bolt on his door, and for one long, terrible moment the old fear had her completely, the fear of being old and alone and unable to protect the one thing that mattered. Then she heard them on the stairs, and going up, toward the 3rd floor, toward the cedar room, and she understood that they had not come for her or for the boy. They had come for the proof, and the proof was 100 miles away in a vault under a number, and a cold, clear calm came over Iris Caldwell in the dark, the same calm that used to come when a man set a thing on her counter and asked her for the truth. She slipped into Eli's room and woke him with a hand over his mouth and her face close to his, and the boy's eyes came open wide and frightened, and she shook her head once, very small, and put her finger to her lips, and he understood, because he had been understanding hard things since he was 6, and he made not one sound. She took him by the hand, and the 2 of them went out the boy's window onto the porch roof, which she had marked the first day as a way down, and along it in their socks in the freezing dark and down the trellis at the corner, and across the frozen yard to the car, and Iris drove down the Falls Road without her lights until she was past the logging cut, and only then turned them on, and only at the spot where the signal caught did she stop and call, with shaking hands, the county sheriff. The men were gone by the time the deputies came, of course. They had gone up to the cedar room and found the false wall, because Crane's people knew the house better than Iris had liked to think, and they had opened it and found the finished collection and not the proof, and they had taken nothing, because 2 patrol cars came up the Falls Road with their lights going, summoned by an old woman who had not panicked, and the men had gone out a back window and into the woods and were never caught. The deputy who took Iris's statement was young and kind and honest about the odds. Professionals, he said. Long gone. Well, dust. We'll see if the neighbor's cameras down the road caught a plate. But I'll tell you straight, ma'am, on a thing like this the recovery rate is poor. Iris signed the statement with Eli asleep at last against her side in the warm office. And she did not tell the deputy that they had taken nothing because there had been nothing left to take, because she had learned, that week, to keep her own counsel. But sitting there at 3 in the morning with her grandson's weight against her and the adrenaline draining out of her into a deep shaking exhaustion, she understood that Damian Crane had just made the mistake that men like him always make in the end. He had sent men into a house with a child in it. And there is no court, and no magazine, and no clever lawyer in the world that can make that look like concern. She stopped being afraid that night, and she stopped playing the frightened old woman. And the morning after the break-in, she went to war the way Cora never could. She did not wait for the magazine to print its story. With Rourke and Solbrandt and Souls Institute, she got out in front of it. There was an honest reporter, it turned out, at a real paper and not a glossy one. A woman who covered the trade and had heard the old whisper about Ashgrove herself and had never been able to prove it. And Rourke brought her up to Hadley Falls. And Iris sat her down at Cora's bench and showed her the high-resolution photographs of the dated and notarized drawings and the prototypes, and Solbrandt explained on the record, his old voice steady, what they were and why there was no honest argument against them. And the reporter, who had been doing this for 30 years and had learned to be hard to move, sat very still for a long time and then said, "This is the biggest thing I will ever write." And she wrote it. And it ran, with the photographs, before the glossy magazine's hit piece could, and it told the whole true story, the firm and the love and the theft, the 60 years and the buyback and the cedar room, the dated drawings and the notary's seal, Cordelia Ashgrove, the woman who made the House of Crane and was erased from it, and her great niece, a retired repair counter jeweler from a corner shop in Easton, who had inherited the proof and refused, where the old woman could not, to keep it in the dark. The story did not fix everything, the way these things never do. But it moved the world an inch, and an inch was all Iris needed, because the truth was so clean and the proof so plain that once people could see it, they could not unsee it. 2 more experts, unconnected to Iris, looked at the published drawings and said the same thing Sol had said, that there was no argument here. The Institute announced it would mount an authentication and an exhibition. And the petition about Iris's capacity, which had looked so frightening on paper, fell apart almost the moment it met daylight, because the woman the petition described, the confused, manipulated, unfit old woman, bore no resemblance at all to the sharp, plain, devastatingly clear woman the whole country was now reading about, the one who had quietly photographed and sealed and scattered the proof before a soul came for it, who had gotten a child out a window and down a trellis in the darkened, called the sheriff with a steady voice while professionals ransacked her house. You cannot argue that a woman is too addled to manage her affairs in the same week the public learns she outthought the legal department of a great house. The judge, when Rourke filed the response with the police report of the break-in attached, with its plain account of 2 men sent into a house where a minor child was sleeping, did not appoint a conservator. The judge dismissed the petition with a sharpness that made the lawyers who had filed it wish they had never put their names to it, and ordered that the parties stop harassing Mrs. Caldwell. And that was the end of the capacity attack. The whole machine snapped clean because it had been built on a lie about Iris, and the lie could not survive being looked at. Dale was the one who broke the back of the rest of it, which Iris would never have predicted the day he stood in her kitchen and told her about the apartments by the medical center. He had documented the bribe. When the lawyer from the city had called him, casual, friendly, hinting at a finder's arrangement for a family member who helped things go smoothly, suggesting that everyone would be better off if Dale would simply confirm that his old aunt had gone soft. Dale had said the right vague things to keep the man talking. And then Dale, who sold commercial insurance and knew exactly what a paper trail was worth, had gone home and written down every word while it was fresh, the date, the time, the offer, the names, and he had saved the follow-up emails the man was careless enough to send. And when the conservatorship petition was filed and Iris called him from the spot on the Falls Road and told him it was happening, Dale had driven 3 hours north that same night and put the whole thing in front of Rourke, the notes, and the emails, a documented attempt by an agent of the House of Crane to bribe a family member into falsely testifying that Iris was incompetent in order to gain control of her property. It was not a thing a court could ignore, and it was not a thing the House of Crane's board of directors could ignore either, when Rourke, with Iris's blessing, made sure both of them saw it. Because that was the move that finished Damian Crane. Not the drawings, in the end, and not even the break-in, but his own people, in writing, trying to buy a false witness against an old woman, on top of a midnight raid on a house with a child in it, on top of 70 years of a stolen name now spread across every paper in the country. The board of the House of Crane was made of people who cared about one thing above all others, which was the brand, the beloved name, the century of trust, and they could do the arithmetic faster than Damian Crane and his fury could stop them. The brand could not survive being the house that hounded a grieving grandmother, bribed her nephew, and sent men into a child's home, all to bury the fact that it had been founded on a theft. The only thing that might save the brand was to do, fast and loudly, the exact opposite of everything Damian Crane had done. He came up the drive one last time, 11 weeks after the first, and the snow was gone and the hills were going green, and the long dark car looked different in the spring light, smaller somehow. He did not have a driver this time. He came alone, and he stood at the bottom of the porch steps, and Iris came out and stood at the top of them, and she did not ask him in. He looked older than he had in November. The silver in his hair had won more ground, or perhaps it only looked that way to a woman who no longer needed to fear him. "They've removed me," he said, without preamble, and Iris understood he was speaking of his own board, his own family's company. "Effective Friday. My grandfather's chair, and they've removed me from it, to save the name." His mouth twisted. "Do you know what they're going to do, your truth and my board between you? They are going to mount an exhibition. They are going to call her the founding designer. They are going to put Ashgrove back on the work, in their own museum, with my grandfather's name beside hers, smaller. Ashgrove and Crane. After 70 years. They are going to make a virtue of it, a story of righting an old wrong, and the brand will survive. It may even be stronger for it. And the only one who will not survive it is me, because someone has to be the one who did the wrong, and my grandfather is dead, so it will be me." He looked up at her, and for one moment there was something almost human in his face, something that might have been the boy he had been before he learned what his family was. "He told me, once, near the end of his life. My grandfather. Drunk. He told me there'd been a woman, that the line had been hers, that he'd taken it. He laughed about it. He said the only mistake he ever made was not destroying her drawings, that he'd always meant to and never got the chance because she ran off to the hills with them, and that someday it would come back on the family because of those drawings, and that I should watch for it." His voice was very quiet. "I have watched for it my whole life. I have been watching that gate for 40 years. And when it finally came, it came as a $100 tax lien and an old woman from a corner shop, and there was nothing I could do, because the truth was on the paper, and the paper was older than the lie." Iris looked down at him from the top of the steps of the house his family had been afraid of for 70 years, and she found that she had no taste for cruelty, that the win was enough, and the gloating would only have made it smaller. "You sent men into my house with my grandson asleep in it," she said, and her voice was level. "That's the part one won't forgive, and you shouldn't ask me to. But I'm not going to spit on you, Mr. Crane. My great-aunt spent 60 years letting what your grandfather did to her eat her alive in the dark, and it killed her slow, the bitterness, the hiding, more than the years did. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put her name in the light, and then I'm going to go live my life with that boy and not think about you and your family one more day than I have to." She paused. "Go home. There's nothing here for you. There never was. It was always hers, and now it's hers again, and you're just the man who happened to be sitting in the chair when the truth came home." He stood a moment longer, and then he nodded, once, the way a man nods when he has finally heard a thing he has spent his life refusing to hear, and he got into the car and drove down the Falls Road into the green of the hills and out of her life for good. The truth did not make her rich the way the stories promise, all at once and clean. It took the better part of a year, but it took it in the right direction, and Iris, who had spent 8 months watching the bottom fall out of everything, watched it come back inch by inch, which was the only way she would have trusted it anyway. The foreclosure was the first to fall. Once the petition collapsed and the story broke and the Institute authenticated the collection, no honest house would touch the note the way Crane's people had meant to use it, and Soul's Institute arranged what they called a bridge against the authenticated pieces, a loan held against the collection until the first proper sale, and with it Iris settled the soured note, and Easton in full, the whole comma of it, and walked out of the bank that had been going to take her home with the deed in her hand, hers, free and clear, the house where Walt had died and where Hannah had grown up, safe at last, never to be taken. She kept it. She had thought she might, and she did, because there were memories in those walls that no fortune could replace, and a person should not let the cruelty of one bad year cost her the good years that came before it. But Ashgrove was where they lived now, where they had been living since November, and it was Ashgrove she set about saving, the great dark ruined house her great-aunt had walled herself up in. She had the roof made sound before the spring rains, and the porch rebuilt, and the failed shutters mended, and it took most of the first proper sale to do it, a sale at Soul's Institute that brought, for one suite of the blue pieces and a handful of the loose stones, more money than Iris could make herself feel as anything but a number on a board. She did not sell the red. The red, the Institute named, with Iris's blessing, the Ashgrove Red, after the woman who had bought it under a borrowed name at 80 and cut it with her mother's tools, and it became the center of the exhibition, the thing people stood in long lines to see, a drop of arterial fire under a single light with a card beside it that told, at last, the true name of the hand that made it. She did not give it all away in a fit of guilt the way she had read, in those few articles, that some heirs of great fortunes do. She thought about it, but she decided, in the end, that Cora had not buried herself alive for 60 years so that Iris could perform her own kind of penance with the proceeds, and that the boy deserved a grandmother who lived in the world and not one wearing a hair shirt. She kept enough to make Eli safe past the end of his own long life, and to make herself safe, and to never again do arithmetic at a cold table at midnight that would not come out right. And then she took the rest, the great unimaginable rest of it, and she did. With it the one thing that felt, to her, like the truth. She made Ashgrove into a place where the work would be seen under the right name, and where the gift in the hands would be passed on. The third floor, the cedar room and the workshop, she left almost as Cora had kept it, and the Institute helped her open it, a few days a season, so that people could come up into the hills and stand at the bench where the House of Crane was truly made and see the dated drawings under glass and understand what had been taken and what had been kept. And on the second floor, she built something Cora had never had and never let herself want, which was a workshop with other people in it. She used the fortune to bring young ones up, the kind she had been, the kind who had the hands and no money and no door open to them, and to pay the old ones, the soul brants who were left, to teach them, the things that are not in any book, how a true color sits in a stone, how a thing that is real catches the light away a thing that only shines never will. She called it the Ashgrove Workshop, the name Cora had drawn herself, all those years ago, in the lettering over a little shop on a good street. And on the first morning it opened, Sol Brant, 92 now, and using 2 canes, sat at the head of the bench with a loop around his neck and a girl of 19 beside him who had the hands and did not yet know what she had, and the old man began to teach her. And Iris stood in the doorway and watched the something he had not done when he was young get done at last, and had to go out into the hall a moment, the way she always did when it got to be too much. Dale ran the books for the workshop, because it turned out that the thing that had made him so maddening, the head for figures, the insistence on doing it right, was exactly the thing a workshop full of dreamers needed, and he was good at it, and Iris watched her nephew find a use for himself that he was prouder of than anything he had ever sold, and the two of them never spoke again of the apartments by the medical center, and did not need to. Marian Pratt kept the house, as she always had, except now there were people in it, and food on the long table, and the great dark rooms were warm and lit, and Marian, who had carried other people's loads her whole life, walked through a full and living Ashgrove with a look on her square, weathered face that Iris could not have put a word to except that it was the look of a person who has watched a thing she loved come back from the dead. Edwin Rourke, who had waited 40 years for someone to sit in his chair and say the right thing, came up the Falls Road for supper most Sundays, and he and Sol Brant, the 2 old men, would sit by the fire and argue about stones and old sails and the way the trade used to be, and Iris would listen. And it was, she thought, the kind of evening her great-aunt could have had any night for 60 years and never let herself have. And that was the saddest part of the whole story, and the part Iris worked hardest to undo, by filling the house Cora had emptied. The town felt it too, the little dead town of Hadley Falls that had been waiting so long for something that never came. The exhibition up the Falls Road brought people into the hills who had never before had a reason to come, and they needed somewhere to eat and somewhere to sleep. And the diner that had run on one cook and one waitress hired two more, and the bed and breakfast that had stood half empty for a decade filled its rooms, and the general store started keeping longer hours. And a young couple bought the shuttered pharmacy on the main street and made it into a coffee place that, to everyone's surprise, the visitors loved. It was not a boom. The hills did not do booms. But it was the first year in longer than anyone could remember that more people moved into Hadley Falls than left it. And Iris, who had come up that road in November a frightened stranger with $100 and a sleeping child, found that by spring the people in town nodded to her on the street and called her by her name, and that the woman at the general store would set aside the good bread when she knew Iris was coming down, the way someone had once done that for Cora and never said. She had arrived a stranger, somewhere across that long, hard year. Without ever quite catching the moment it happened, she had become one of them, which was its own kind of coming home. And the boy, Eli, grew that year the way children do when the ground under them finally stops shaking. He had come to Iris a small, grave, watchful thing who slept with a compass under his pillow because he needed to know which way the lost people had gone. And over that long year, the war and the winning and the warm, full house, Iris watched the watchfulness go out of him by degrees, watched him get loud, get silly, get to be a boy, the way grief and fear had never let him be. He spent his afternoons in the workshop, because of course he did, and Iris found him one day at Cora's bench with the old steel loop to his eye, bent over a stone with the exact still attention she had seen in her own hands and in the dead woman's letter, and she stood and watched him without his knowing. The fourth generation of those hands, Cora's mother and Cora and Iris and now this small boy, and she did not say a word, because some things should not be interrupted. He still carried the compass, but she noticed, that spring, that he had stopped checking it the anxious way he used to, the way that asked which direction the safe place had been. He just carried it now, the way you carry a thing that was your grandfather's because it was your grandfather's. And one evening near the end of that first full year, sitting on the rebuilt porch in the long light with Iris, watching the green hills, he took it out and turned it over in his hands and looked at the needle swing and settle, and he said, "Graham, you know how I used to check this all the time, to know how to get back?" And Iris said she knew, and Eli looked out at the hills and said, "I don't really need to anymore, because back is just here now." And then he put the compass in his pocket and asked if there was any more of the pie Marian made, the way a boy does, and went inside, and Iris sat alone on the porch a while in the last of the light with her eyes full and her heart, for the first time in a very long time, completely at rest. She went up to the cedar room sometimes, in the evenings, alone. The drawings were under glass now, and the finest pieces were in the world where people could see them, but the bench was still there, and her gray-tans tools, and Iris would sit at it as the light went and think about the woman she had never met, who had watched her whole life from a distance and decided she had the hands and the spine, and who had been right about the hands and right, in the end, about the spine, and who had left her not a fortune but a choice, the choice she herself had been too afraid to make for 60 years. Some inheritances are money, and money is not nothing. Money kept the house and saved the boy and paid the old men to teach the young ones. But the thing Cora Ashgrove had truly left her, the thing that mattered, was not in any of the trays. It was the chance to do the brave thing instead of the safe one, to carry a true thing out of the dark and into the light where it could do some good, to refuse, where one frightened woman could not, to be made small. That was the real inheritance. That was what had been waiting at the end of a 3-hour drive into the hills, behind a wall built to look like a wall, for a woman down to her last $100 who had nothing left to lose and chose, against all the sensible advice in the world, to go and see. The two cupped hands were carved everywhere in that house, in the wax and the wood and the glass and the small key, a pair of hands holding a single point of light. Iris had thought, the first night, that it was only a jeweler's signature, the held light setting that had made a stolen house famous. She understood it differently now. A held thing. A small, bright, fragile thing, cupped and carried and kept from going out. That was what Cora had done with the truth for 60 years, cupped it in the dark and kept it alive when she could not bear to set it free. And that was what Iris had finally done that she could not, opened her hands, and let the light out, and let the world see, at last, what had always been there, held and waiting in the hands. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.